The U.S. housing market is hitting a deep freeze. In states like Texas and Florida, half-built house frames stand abandoned under the sun. In Alberta and British Columbia, trucks loaded with lumber still leave the mills, but no longer head south as they once did. Washington's decision to impose nearly 35% tariffs on Canadian softwood lumber is cutting into a trade route that has existed for decades, sending ripples through America's construction industry. The official message from Washington is straightforward: protect American workers and shield the domestic lumber industry. But behind that message is a far more complicated reality. Canada supplies an average of 1.44 million cubic meters of softwood lumber to the U.S. every month. Domestic sawmills could replace only about a third of that in the short term. Expanding U.S. capacity enough to fill the gap could take 5 to 10 years, assuming environmental and political obstacles could be overcome. Logging restrictions, a shortage of skilled labor, and a limited number of operational sawmills make rapid expansion nearly impossible. The timing couldn't have been worse for the U.S. housing sector. Even before the tariffs, demand for lumber was high, fueled by a housing shortage, post-wildfire reconstruction in California, hurricane recovery along the coasts, and large-scale infrastructure projects. When the tariffs hit, costs surged almost immediately. Contractors halted projects or scaled them down. Housing developments in Texas suburbs stalled. In Illinois, apartment projects were frozen midstream. In disaster-hit areas, rebuilding slowed to a crawl. Economists estimate the tariffs pushed construction costs up by 10 to 15% in just a few months. A wood frame house that once required $40,000 in materials could now cost $4,000 to $6,000 more. For families with fixed incomes or first-time buyers, that difference can be enough to put home ownership out of reach. In California, one construction company said material costs for each rebuilding project could rise by millions of dollars within months. In the meantime, construction workers faced layoffs, directly impacting household incomes. The impact stretches beyond housing. Furniture makers, flooring manufacturers, and door producers are paying more for raw materials. Some small factories are struggling to stay profitable. Logistics costs are also rising as buyers turn to alternative suppliers in Europe or South America, suppliers whose products often cost more and take weeks longer to arrive. In Canada, sawmill owners are feeling the shock from the other side. Long-term U.S. contracts are being suspended, leaving warehouses full of unsold lumber. But Ottawa is responding differently. Instead of retaliatory tariffs or high-profile political battles, Canada is rolling out a $1 billion support package for its softwood lumber sector. This includes loan guarantees, subsidies to encourage value-added products over raw exports, and funding to train and retain workers. Nearly $700 million is earmarked for small and medium-sized companies, the group most vulnerable to market volatility. What makes this strategy notable is its connection to Canada's $25 billion federal housing program. By driving domestic demand for lumber, Ottawa reduces dependence on U.S. buyers while simultaneously addressing its own housing shortages. At the same time, Canada is actively courting new markets. Japan, Vietnam, and European countries are already in discussions for long-term supply agreements. This approach could transform a short-term crisis into a long-term opportunity to diversify Canada's export base. For the U.S., finding replacement sources is proving difficult. Europe's timber industry can supply only a fraction of what Canada once delivered. Shipping across the Atlantic raises costs and delays deliveries by weeks, untenable for urgent needs like post-disaster rebuilding. Domestically, U.S. sawmills are already near full capacity. Doubling output would require years of investment, relaxed regulations, and expanded logging rights, changes that carry significant political risk. This leaves Washington in a tough position. The tariffs may protect one segment of the industry in the short term, but they are also raising costs for millions of Americans and slowing housing development nationwide. At the same time, Canada is moving steadily toward less reliance on the U.S. market. For every month that passes, Ottawa builds stronger trade links with other partners, making it harder for Washington to regain its former leverage. Softwood lumber has long been a flashpoint in U.S.-Canada trade relations, with disputes dating back to the 1980s. Over the years, temporary agreements have cooled tensions, only for them to flare up again. Despite the political battles, the supply chain between the two countries has remained deeply integrated. Nearly 70% of softwood lumber imported into the U.S. still comes from Canada. From suburban homebuilding to post-disaster reconstruction, Canadian lumber has been a critical component of the American economy. Now, that link is being tested. In British Columbia, industry leaders warn that U.S. shortages will directly affect lumber prices, building costs, and ultimately the price of homes. The result could be a chain reaction: shortages drive up costs, costs slow construction, and slower construction worsens the housing shortage. Canada's calm approach, focused on internal investment and global market diversification, stands in contrast to Washington's protectionist stance. Ottawa's willingness to discuss export quotas for the first time signals a strategic shift, using softwood lumber as a bargaining chip in broader trade negotiations. Quotas could ease tariff pressures without dismantling Canada's core industries. The real question is whether the US has played its strongest card too early. By imposing steep tariffs now, Washington may have given Canada the time and incentive to secure alternative buyers. And once those markets are in place, Canada's dependence on the US could diminish permanently. In the bigger picture, the dispute is part of a changing global trade map. While South Korea and the EU have signed agreements with Washington, accepting moderate tariffs for stability, Canada has so far retained most of its advantages under the USMCA. Its energy exports, defense partnerships, and key manufacturing links with the US remain unaffected, giving it room to maneuver. As American housing sites stand silent and Canadian neighborhoods push ahead, the contrast is hard to ignore. Trade wars often promise quick victories, but in this case, patience and long-term planning may prove the stronger strategy. This is True State Report. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.